There is a city in Russia where 100,000 people lived, worked, and died, and it did not exist. Not on any map. Not in any census. Not in any official document the Soviet government ever let the world see. And the things they were building inside it were designed to kill millions. By the end of this, you'll know where these cities were, what was happening inside them, and why the people who lived there were forbidden from telling their own families where they slept at night. This is the story of the Soviet Union's secret closed cities, and the bioweapon labs they left rotting inside them. Let's start with something that should be impossible. Imagine you're a cartographer in 1960. Your job is to map the Soviet Union, every river, every road, every settlement. But your government hands you a list of places you are forbidden to draw. Towns with tens of thousands of residents. Factories. Hospitals. Schools. Entire functioning cities. And you scratch them off the map like they were never there. This wasn't fiction. This was standard Soviet operational procedure. They were called closed cities, in Russian, Zakrytaya Goroda. But insiders knew them by a different name, the Atomgrads, the numbered cities, the mailbox towns. Because that's how you addressed a letter to someone who lived there. Not a city name. A postal code. A number. A mailbox. Mailbox 10. Mailbox 7. If you wrote the wrong thing on the envelope, the letter disappeared. And sometimes, so did the person it was meant for. At their peak, the Soviets operated over 40 of these classified settlements across Russia and the former Soviet republics. Combined population, over 1 million people. Living inside a system so secretive that even the KGB agents assigned to monitor them had to go through a separate clearance process just to enter. You didn't choose to live in a closed city. You were recruited. Scientists, engineers, weapons specialists, hand-selected, background-checked, and relocated. And once you were inside, leaving required written permission from the state. Your children grew up there. Your parents might never know exactly where you were. You sent letters through sensors. You made calls through monitored switchboards. And the city around you? Invisible. Erased from every atlas, every encyclopedia, every official record available to the outside world. Here's what makes this stranger than you might expect. Life inside the closed cities wasn't grim. Not at first. While the rest of the Soviet Union stood in bread lines, residents of closed cities had fully stocked grocery stores. Better housing. Better hospitals. Better schools. The Soviet state wasn't punishing these people, it was buying their silence with comfort. One former resident of Sarev, the closed city that housed the Soviet nuclear weapons program, known for decades only as Artemis-16, described it later as the most normal place I ever lived. Clean streets. Community theaters. Ice rinks. Parks. A functioning civil society tucked inside a razor-wire perimeter with armed checkpoints at every entry road. But the comfort had a hard edge. The perimeter fencing at Artemis-16 stretched for over 40 kilometers. Guard towers. Motion sensors. Dogs. If you wandered too close to the fence without authorization, soldiers had standing orders. You didn't get a warning. Visitors from outside required a formal invitation, approved weeks in advance by the city's military commander. Your spouse's family, if they lived in the open Soviet Union, could not simply come to see where you lived. They applied. They waited. They were investigated. And frequently, they were denied. The isolation was total. Psychological. Generational. Children born in Artemis-16 grew up believing that the checkpoints and the secrecy were simply how the world worked. Some of them didn't learn the real name of their city until they were adults. But here's what they didn't tell you about these places. Some of the closed cities weren't building bombs. They were building something that scared even the Soviet military leadership. Something that to this day, remains one of the most classified chapters of the Cold War. Sverdlovsk, 19. Stepnogorsk. Vozrozhdeniya Island. These weren't nuclear cities. These were the laboratories of Biopreparat, the Soviet Union's top-secret biological weapons program. And the cities built around them were perhaps the most dangerous places on Earth. Biopreparat officially didn't exist. It was registered in Soviet bureaucracy as a network of pharmaceutical research institutes. 30,000 scientists worked inside it at its height. They were developing, and mass-producing, weaponized anthrax, smallpox, plague, and agents that had no name in any Western intelligence database. In April 1979, something went wrong in Sverdlovsk, 19. A clogged filter. A shift change. A moment of bureaucratic failure. And anthrax spores were released into the air above a closed city that the world didn't know existed. 64 people died in the weeks that followed. Soviet authorities told the world it was contaminated black market meat. They told their own people the same thing. The KGB confiscated hospital records. Autopsies were rewritten. Death certificates were altered. The victims were buried in a cemetery that was later quietly relocated. It wasn't until 1992, after the Soviet collapse, that Boris Yeltsin finally admitted what had happened. Not contaminated meat. An aerosolized anthrax release from a weapons facility inside a city that had never appeared on a single public map. The West had suspected for years. But suspicion and proof are very different things. And the Soviets had spent 13 years making sure no proof survived. But here's what even that admission didn't cover. After 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed in a matter of months. And the closed cities were simply abandoned. Not decommissioned. Not cleaned. Not secured. Abandoned. The scientists left. The soldiers left. The KGB files were either shredded or vanished into Russian state archives. And the labs, the actual physical laboratories where the world's most dangerous pathogens had been cultivated, tested, and stored, were left to decay. Vozrozhdeniya Island, in the Aral Sea, hosted open-air testing of weaponized anthrax for decades. When Soviet forces left in 1992, they buried an estimated 100 to 200 tons of anthrax spores in the ground, and walked away. American scientists who visited the site in the late 1990s found something that made them go pale. The anthrax wasn't dead. Anthrax spores can survive in soil for decades. Possibly centuries. And as the Aral Sea dried up, an environmental catastrophe already in progress, the island was becoming a peninsula. Connected to the mainland. Accessible to animals. To people. To the wind. A joint US-Uzbek decontamination effort was quietly launched in 2002. It was classified for years. Because if the public knew that a former Soviet bioweapon test site was now accessible by foot, the questions that would follow were ones no government wanted to answer. And Vozrozhdeniya was just one site. Stepnogorsk, in Kazakhstan, was the largest anthrax production facility ever built. At peak capacity it could produce 300 tons of weaponized anthrax per year. When Ken Alibek, a former Biopreparat deputy director who defected to the United States in 1992, described the facility to American intelligence, they didn't believe him. The scale was simply too large. He was telling the truth. The buildings are still there. Some of them. Rusting. Crumbling. In a city that still doesn't appear on most maps of Kazakhstan. Here's the part of this story that doesn't make it into the intelligence reports. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the people inside the closed cities didn't disappear with it. They were still there. Scientists who had spent their entire careers building weapons the world wasn't supposed to know existed, were suddenly unemployed. Living in cities with no economic purpose. Cut off from a state that no longer existed. The Russian government slowly began opening some closed cities in the early 1990s. Releasing them into a market economy they had no preparation for. Residents who had lived inside a bubble of state provision, guaranteed work, guaranteed housing, guaranteed food, were dropped into chaos. Some of the weapons scientists emigrated. The United States ran a quiet program through the 1990s called the Nunlugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, which paid former Soviet weapons scientists a salary specifically so they wouldn't sell their expertise to the highest bidder. Because that was the real fear. Not the abandoned labs. Not the anthrax in the soil. The fear was the knowledge. Walking around. Looking for work. Several closed cities remain classified to this day. They are listed in Russian administrative records as closed administrative territorial formations. You cannot visit without government permission. The roads leading to them don't appear on commercial maps. Google Maps shows fields. 100,000 people. Still living in a city. That officially isn't there. The Soviet closed cities were not a conspiracy theory. They were policy. They were infrastructure. They were home to millions of people across 5 decades, and the governments of the world looked the other way because the alternative, acknowledging what was being built inside them, was too dangerous to admit. Some of those labs are still out there. Some of those spores are still in the ground. And some of those cities are still on no map you will ever find. The Cold War didn't end. It just stopped being televised. If this broke something loose in your brain, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next time, the real reason the Aral Sea was drained, and why some researchers believe it wasn't an accident.